How have my thoughts about Satan evolved over time? Is Jesus a myth or a conglomeration of multiple people? And what's the best version of the Bible to use? So in this video, I'm going to do a sort of year-end question and answer. I had put a call out for Q&A questions, and I got a ton of them. So I'm actually going to do 2 Q&As. This one's going to be on biblical studies, and then the second one will be on like deconstruction. So this is biblical studies. So if you're here for deconstruction, I hope you keep watching, but if not, you know that it'll be coming up really soon. So I took a quick look at these questions. There's a lot of different questions. This is not in any particular order, and I haven't done any prep really to answer these, so I hope this kind of works, but you can listen and be the judge. But thank you so much for those of you who sent in questions. There's so many fantastic questions. I don't think I have the answers to all of them. I'll do my best, and in some cases I might just say I don't know. But yeah, without further ado, let's go. These were your questions that pertain to biblical studies. How have thoughts and considerations of the Ha-Satan evolved over time? So basically, like how was the evolution of Satan? It's a really good question. It's not my area of specialty. I can give you like a really quick overview as I understand it. So as I understand it, Satan probably started in heaven as opposed to in hell, which is what you get like in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Job, for example. Satan is a member of the divine council, so sort of like an angelic figure, and then slowly, I guess you could say, gets kicked out of heaven, not literally, but sort of in terms of the mythology of Satan. The word Satan really just means like accuser. So Satan, as I understand it, what seems likely to have happened is that at some point between the Babylonian exile and the 1st century, Satan seems to have evolved to be a character that eventually people saw as leading a band of like evil angels. You can see, for example, the book of Enoch is like the most famous. The first book of Enoch is really famous for this, where you get the story of the Watchers as like these fallen angels, and Satan probably being the leader of those. So I think what happened with Satan, as I understand, I think it probably came through contact with, I want to say Zoroastrianism, like with the dualism of Zoroastrianism, during the Babylonian captivity or shortly after, because in Zoroastrianism, there's a clear, like a good angel and a clear, like there's like a Holy Spirit figure, but there's also like a Satan figure in Zoroastrianism. So that kind of dualism, I think, was brought into Judaism, into like Second Temple Judaism, and we can see it like in the literature. And then you get eventually the figure in the Gospels, for example, in Mark, where Satan's tempting Jesus in the desert and is clearly sort of an evil figure. So I think that evolution happens over time. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the famous passages between like 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles or something. I'd have to look it up after. I'll put a note down below. But there's this famous passage where in one story, it's to do with the census when there's a census of Israel. And in one case, it's the angel of the Lord that kind of tells David to do it. And in the other reworked story, it's I'm going to Google it. Hold on. Here we go. 2 Samuel. Yeah, so 2 Samuel 24:1 says that it's the Lord that incited David, and 1 Chronicles 21:1 says that it's David that incited David. That it's Satan that incited David to have a census. So there you go. So that's a few really quick things on Satan and the evolution of Satan. I hope that's a little helpful. It's not my expertise. I just kind of have to rely on scholars as well. Okay, second question. Is it possible that the Jesus of the Gospels is actually an amalgamation of multiple historical Jesus figures, specifically thinking of multiple Jesus figures recorded in the writings of Josephus? I do think it's possible. I think it's a really interesting question, and I remember I've talked a lot about his book because it really was a really good one that I read this year, James McGrath, because I was talking about some of the things that I think got pulled over from John the Baptist to Jesus, including the nativity stories. But one of the things I talked about with James McGrath is the possibility that there were other stories about these signs prophets, that it was this movement around John the Baptist and people like him in the Galilee or in Judea, that there were a bunch of these kind of figures, and we see some more like zealot revolutionary figures in Josephus. So the Galilee and Judea were full of people like this, so it's understandable that some of those stories might have eventually been worked into historical Jesus stories. The problem is it's really just tough. Like short of John the Baptist stories where we can actually see them being reworked, it's really tough to put your finger on it. But I do think it's definitely possible. I just don't know how to access that. But I think it's a really interesting question, and I would love to see more work done on this in the future as to like how the ideas of other people were rolled into the historical Jesus, that would be really, really, or historical Jesus, like the Jesus of the Gospels. That would be super interesting. Question 4, what do you think about mythicism? And do you think it's possible that Paul got his celestial Christ figure, some sort of super angel like Metatron, from Philo of Alexandria? And do you think the Gospels use the Jesus ben Ananias narrative in Josephus? Okay, one at a time. Mythicism. This is a famous kind of question right now. It's not something I really heard about in the academy at all. This is predominantly one of those things that people on the internet are a lot more interested in than biblical scholars, as far as I can tell. I'm interested in the idea of mythicism. I don't really see it. You'd have to, and again, okay, so let me preface this by saying I know Richard Carrier has been the big person kind of fighting for this interpretation, and I have not read his latest book, so maybe there's more in there that will change my mind on mythicism. But in general, I still think what I see with this historical Jesus is a figure that was probably historic. I think there's really strong evidence for that, but then I think a lot of the Gospels are not historic. But I think the problem is you have a historic figure that there just wasn't that much records for at the time, so you end up having to backfill some of the story in with things like his life or his sayings or his nativity or whatever. That's still kind of what I see. And I see that Jesus, I see the religion evolving in multiple places at different times, in different places around the empire, and beyond. So I don't really find mythicism all that convincing yet, but I'm certainly interested in the arguments. I don't think there may be people who don't want to consider it for ideological reasons. I think it's really interesting to consider the possibility that Jesus may have been a myth. But as of right now, I haven't yet been convinced that there's good evidence for it. Is it possible Paul got his celestial Christ figure from Philo of Alexandria? I don't think so. I don't see. It's a tough call. Like when you look at the Philippians hymn, for example, there's an ongoing question of like whether that is about a human. There's a certain way of reading the Philippians hymn that almost makes it sound. So the Philippians hymn is like, who being in the form of God did not think it was robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, etc., etc. So some of that language almost sounds like when a divinity puts on human skin. It almost sounds like mystery cult kind of language, Hellenistic mystery cult language. I don't know that it's strictly Logos philosophy, but some people will argue that it is. So I don't actually see it as that similar to Philo of Alexandria. And I think Philo gets really close to calling the Logos, to like personifying the Logos, but he doesn't quite get there. So I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that more. But so far I don't see Paul getting his celestial Christ figure from Philo. If anything, I would see maybe more like mystery cult relationships, but I'm not sure. And did the Gospels use Jesus ben Ananias narrative in Josephus? I don't think so. I think Luke used Josephus. I think that's a pretty convincing thing, but I'm not convinced that they took any specific stories from other figures in Josephus. And Jesus is a common enough name that especially like a revolutionary name, Yeshua. I'm not really sure that just because they share a name either that there's that similarity. Okay, this person asks, how likely is it that Jesus never existed? Sorry, my dog's barking. This person asks, how likely is it that Jesus never existed and Paul made everything up? Kind of the same answer. I don't see it as that. It does seem that Paul had a real connection to Jesus' family at some point. I just had James Tabor on, so I was thinking about this, but Jesus' family does seem connected to the early Jesus movement. So I don't think Paul made everything up. But that being said, you can look, for example, if I'm remembering correctly, the reconstructions that have been done of Marcion's letters of Paul, if I remember correctly, they're thinking that some of the Jerusalem stuff wasn't actually in Marcion's Paul, which maybe means it was added later. So that would be an interesting avenue into Paul making everything up. I'm not sure, but yeah, so far I'm not convinced by that. I also have to see. I was just watching a video the other day, so this also makes me think of this. That Paul wasn't really very well liked or accepted by a lot of his communities, according to his letters. So he is sort of doing some pleading based on his own interpretation of Jesus' methods and mission. And it seems like there was other people who probably disagreed with him about what those are or were. So I don't think it was just a religion that just came off of Paul. I haven't read Nina Livincy. Sorry, Nina. I haven't read her new book yet, which I do believe argues this. So I need to read it and give it a fair shot, and maybe I can have her on the podcast this year. Okay. If Marcion's version of Luke is more original than ours, we lose Markan priority. Why is that? I think this is something that Mark Goodacre said, if I remember correctly. In Marcion's Luke, I think what he's arguing here is that if you put another gospel either in between or after Mark or something, like, it depends a bit on how you square this circle, but it would change the Markan priority model that we currently use for the synoptic problem. So if you stick Marcion's gospel into the synoptic problem, it would kind of confuse how we actually square that circle. So it would really upheave a lot of the synoptic problem. I'm thinking maybe that's what this question is in response to. Okay, controversial opinions. Okay, here we're getting into some kind of generic stuff. What is your most controversial opinion, or just opinion in general, that might not necessarily be held for a scholarly reason? You might think it's fun, for instance. I think, okay, so there was a school called the History of Religions School, like 150 years ago in Germany. And they started to argue that early Christianity basically pulled a lot of things from the mystery cults. And they had to pull back on this, and they were criticized because it's just hard to prove. But I'm always interested in the correlation between early Christian movement and mystery cults, like the cult of Isis, or the cult of like, what else would be like Asclepius or something. But I also think this is like my weird pet theory. And I think it hasn't really been shown yet one way or the other, but I'm really curious about the connection between a Theos Hupsistos movement. So there's this movement, basically, we know a little bit about it. It was these people who worship the Most High God, and Theos Hupsistos is like the Most High God. And some people have questioned whether that, like, for 100 years, people have questioned whether this was potentially a group of Jews or connected to Jews. We know that Jews were Theos Hupsistos followers at some point, but we don't know if this is a Jewish movement. And this, at some point, has also been seen as an explanation for the birth of Christianity, as coming out of these Theos Hupsistos cults. I can't prove it. I don't know if you can. There's really not enough to go on. Stephen Mitchell has done a lot of work on this, and his work is worth reading on it. But it is just an interesting ongoing question about, like, whether there's some kind of correlation between those Theos Hupsistos cults and the birth of Christianity. So that's just I don't know if it's super controversial, but that's just a fun opinion. So there you go. Could you explain your view of the likely dates of the Gospels, and particularly why you date them when you do? I don't have, like, this might be surprising, but I don't have a really firm dating of the Gospels. I'm convinced that there's a window that they fall within, and it's somewhere between like 70 and 150, and I don't really know where. I'm going to say 150 and, like, think about it for a minute, but it depends a bit on, like, there's the famous, like, testimony of Papias that seems to talk about maybe the Gospel of Mark. What is he talking about there? So there's like different questions, but I think one of the main problems I have with any dating of the Gospels is just there's not much to go on. Scholars have kind of just thrown around the dates like 70, 80, 90 as if they're really, really established. You can have a terminus post ante quem. Did I get that right? The earliest possible date for the Gospels. Usually we go from the destruction of the temple, which Mark seems to know about, which happens in 70. So all the Gospels usually are seen to have happened maybe a little bit before that, but probably 70 or after. But like, even like, if you read Luke 21 almost sounds like it could have been written after 135. It talks about like the Gentiles trampling over Jerusalem. Well, even the abomination of desolation, like Mark talks about the abomination of desolation, and the temple was destroyed, but there wasn't another, in 135, there was actually a pagan temple built in Jerusalem, and that didn't happen until 135. So, like, do some of those things in the Gospels point to the 135 date for the destruction? Like, you just don't really know. Like, you're trying to piece together these kind of vague prophecies that are being created and put in the lips of Jesus and trying to use that to date the Gospels. And that's really all you can really go on. I mean, you could try to find like different theological controversies in the Gospel. I don't really think they're there. So I don't really have a very strong view of the dates of the Gospels. I know that sounds really weird, but the first points, I had a video that I did, and it was literally just like, we don't know. Like, there's just so much we don't know about the dates of the Gospels, but it just gets like, scholars are constantly kind of regurgitating these dates, so people think like, oh, they're really firmly fixed. And then the other question you have to think about is like, well, what if there was different phases? Like one somebody might say, well, take the Gospel of Luke and there was a different form with Marcion, or take the Gospel of John and maybe the prologue was added later, or maybe the last 3 chapters, the last 1 chapter was added later. So you're looking at these books that obviously evolved. So like, just because somebody knows about 1 chapter of John, say, let's say P52, just because P52 shows a little chunk of John, and if we could, we can't, but if we could date it to 150 or something, we can't actually do that. But even if we could, what would that mean? Like, did that mean the end of John was there? So it's just like this complicated. I think we really underestimate how complicated it is to actually determine this. And I think as a result, I'm just pretty agnostic about the dates of the Gospels and how much we can actually know about them. Okay, I'm going to try and keep my answers a little shorter. Top 3 contradictions that made you stop believing in inerrancy. I made a video about this. Judas was really, once I saw it, I couldn't stop. I couldn't get away from the fact that it was a clear contradiction. Judas, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the 2 creation stories. What's another? I'm trying to think about another contradiction that like really made me stop believing in inerrancy, but I think it was those 2 were the first 2, and then after that, I remember something about Paul. Like, I think I realized at some point that the timing didn't line up between the way Paul describes his travels and the way Acts describes it. I think maybe with like him going back to Jerusalem or something. So there was something in there that maybe was really hard to believe, hard to realize too. So when I did, I stopped believing in inerrancy. This question: why don't the completely different genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke count as an error? I think they do. I think they do count as an error. I just had James Tabor on, and he sees one of them as a genealogy of Mary, which he kind of made a case for. And this is something people have been saying since like early Christianity, because they've recognized that there is a contradiction in the genealogies, specifically in like who the name of Joseph's father was. Yeah, I still think it's an error. I think James Tabor's interpretation is interesting, which that it's Mary's genealogy, and that Joseph's father in Luke is not actually Joseph's father; it's actually Mary's father. I think I've done that right. But anyway, they are technically an error as far as I can tell. Okay, Matthew makes some far-fetched claims of Jesus as related to the Old Testament, abstract and ridiculous. Why didn't God sort out that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem and not have him born in Nazareth? Usually the way to see this, I'm not sure this is a question about like the prophecy. I'm going to try and see if I can make some sense out of this. The difference between Nazareth and Bethlehem, usually it's assumed that Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, but the Bethlehem stories were invented to place him in Bethlehem to align with the famous prophecy in, is it Micah, that you, Bethlehem, even though you're least among the cities of Judah. So that's usually, I think, why the Bethlehem thing happens. So it's not really thought, as far as I know, that Bethlehem was the historic birthplace of Jesus. It's just the place that it sort of had to happen if you want to read the prophecy. Okay, historical, let's keep going. Do you think there's a possibility that Jesus, or one of a couple of figures who combined to create the biblical Jesus, actually was a Proto-Gnostic teacher? Could a Proto-Gnostic Jesus have been merged with various messianic figures from the 1st century? I think that the tricky part of this question is like, was Jesus a Proto-Gnostic teacher? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Like Gnosticism, just like Pauline Christianity, just like everything, just like Orthodox Christianity, did come from the Jesus movement. So there is a line between that and Gnosticism. Now, I mean, some scholars of like different Gnostic movements will say that they pre-existed Christianity, or maybe they came out of Egypt and like got mixed in or something. So there's maybe some different origin trajectories there. But I think to some extent, I think it's hard if you look at the historical, not the historical Jesus. It's hard if you look at the Jesus of the Gospels to see a lot of Gnosticism there, or a lot of Gnostic roots there. But that being said, were there other Gospels? We know that there were so-called Gnostic Gospels. So it probably depends on which Gospel you have. So I don't know. Jesus, I would say, was a Proto-Gnostic teacher, but the thing is, what people did with his teachings, different interpretations, one of which was Proto-Orthodoxy and one of which was later Gnosticism. Could a Proto-Gnostic Jesus have been merged with various messianic figures from the first century? Yeah, I already kind of talked about that. I think it's very possible, but it's just really hard to get purchase on that particular question, other than John the Baptist, and I think there's a lot of crossover. What are your thoughts on the scholarship of Dennis McDonald and Richard C. Miller? I was going to make a joke about Richard C. Miller, but we text each other a lot of our random questions. Maybe sometime I'll get him on and we'll just read our text chains and respond to them, because I ask him a lot of questions and he's always thinking about something. So we have good conversations. Dennis McDonald, I know as well. I confess I haven't read a ton of his books. I've more like heard him in interviews. I even forget the one that I recently read. What was the title of it? I don't remember. But yeah, I like his work. I like Richard C. Miller's work. I have his book and I've done a thing on it and I've interviewed him. So yeah, both great people. Have you looked into the parallels between the Homeric epics and the Gospels and Acts? No more than like reading what I've read and listening to Dennis McDonald talk about it. So the difficulty, okay, this is the next question. The difficulty I have in accepting Christianity is that there's no consistent historical standard that leads to accepting the supernatural claims of Jesus and rejecting those of, say, Apollonius of Tyana. Both did miracles according to the biography. Any thoughts? Yeah, I agree 100%. And there was just, as of this week, there's just been this like go back and forth between Dan McClellan and Wes Huff on the question of undesigned coincidences. I don't know if you've been watching that, but I've been watching it because it's fun. But I think it's exactly the problem, is that if you start to think about undesigned coincidences or supernatural claims in the Gospels, you have to give that to other things, and other figures have similar claims. So yeah, I mean, I think biographies are a certain genre. I think biographies of people like Jesus existed. We don't have that many, but the Apollonius of Tyana is a really good example to show exactly how a figure who people think is exceptional could become even larger than life with his biography. The other one is Aesop is another example of a person like that. Okay, Josephus questions. Let's see. Are you convinced by recent scholarship which claims that the Josephus letter regarding Jesus is authentic? I haven't had a chance to read the book in question yet. I know this is going to sound like a cop out, all these questions, but there's a lot to keep up with. And when you're trying to keep up with biblical scholarship, there's a lot of different angles to actually because I'm not just going to listen to the argument. I actually want to read Schmidt. Schmidt is the guy who's talking about this. So I haven't had a chance to read his book yet. So I'm not yet convinced that Josephus's letter regarding Jesus is authentic. I tend to think somewhere like that famous middle ground, that probably parts of it are authentic, but probably not the part that says he was the Christ. Okay, another question on Josephus. Given Josephus's somewhat questionable historical accuracy and character, how do scholars take him so seriously as to consider his accounts as the main external source for the historicity of Jesus? Yeah, this is a good question, and I think a lot of times when I cite Josephus, people will be like, well, how do you know Josephus is accurate? Like if I'm saying Luke is wrong about the census, and I say, well, Josephus tells us about it. Well, how do you know Josephus is accurate? The thing is, we don't perfectly. It's not using Josephus is not a perfect science. Josephus has mistakes and he has errors and that sort of thing. But there is a question of method. When there's something that Josephus is reporting that he genuinely doesn't really care that much, but then say a gospel author is trying to then make, for example, with Luke and the census under Quirinius, I think Luke gets that idea from Josephus. But Luke is using that to try to get Jesus' birth to Bethlehem because of this census. So it's looking at what an author is actually using this for. I had somebody ask, like, how do we know? Because I had interviewed Steve Mason. I've done a few videos on this because I think Luke knew and used Josephus. And then the question is, well, what if Josephus knew and used Luke? But the problem is Luke just has these like throwaway things. So for example, in Acts, there's a speech by Gamaliel, and Gamaliel talks about Judas the Galilean and Theudas, so two like revolutionary figures, and he just like Gamaliel in Luke it's just a throwaway, and then Josephus gives us a lot more detail on these figures. So it doesn't really work. It only works in one direction. It only works if Acts knows Josephus and then just says, oh yeah, that's the time when that person, Judas the Galilean, for example, was a rebel at that time. But like, he doesn't give us any of the stories. So you'd have to imagine, if it went the other way, that Josephus is taking tiny little bits from Luke and like expanding these into big historical narratives, which just doesn't make sense. Like, it really does make the best sense working the other way. So Josephus is not, it's not that Josephus gives us perfect historical accuracy, but when there are things that Josephus doesn't have an axe to grind, there's no reason why he would misrepresent the historical details, but the gospel writers, by contrast, do clearly have an iron in the fire, as it were. Is that the right? I don't even think that's the right expression. The gospel writers do clearly have something they want to get from, using historical details. Then you do have to be careful using them as history, because they're not written to be history. They're written to be biography. Whereas Josephus is actually ostensibly writing history, I would say. Not a perfect answer, but that's kind of why Josephus isn't perfect, but he's usually the best we have for that world of Jesus. Okay, let me keep going here. Who are the only biblical characters who personally wrote books in the Bible, and how do we know they wrote them? Oh God. This is a good question, but I'm trying to think, like, for Hebrew Bible, I'd have to like go through and think. I'm thinking like Isaiah, for example. Usually first Isaiah is considered like authentic, and then there's second Isaiah is like the second part of it. I forget how the chapters are broken up, but and then sometimes there's like a third Isaiah. So these are seen as like a school of Isaiah. So like Isaiah probably wrote the first, is it 39? I think it's first 39. Let me look it up quick. First Isaiah. Yeah, 39. Aha, there you go. My memory served. So there's cases like that. But each individual thing, it's going to be a question. In the New Testament, it's only really the letters of Paul that I know I sound kind of cynical. I'm only convinced that the letters of Paul were written by who they say they were in the New Testament. Anything else? I can't actually think of anything else. I think some people argue about James. I don't know, like James is a really interesting book. I don't know how to assess if it's actually written by the brother of Jesus. It's really, really well written and really beautiful Greek grammar writing. Like it's really elegant, and it does seem to show a slightly different Christianity than Paul. Whether it comes from the brother of Jesus or just from somebody who thinks like him, I don't know. But yeah, the only one I'd be really confident saying for sure are the letters of Paul in the New Testament. Okay, why do you think there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament? I don't know. Like, this sounds like such a cop-out, and if you Google this, like, go try to look for it, and people are going to say, like, well, they're different characters, and this is what, or different characters of Jesus, different portrayals of Jesus. This is famously what Irenaeus says when he starts to argue about why we need 4 Gospels, because there's 4 winds and there's 4 seasons. Does he say 4 seasons? I don't know if he says 4 seasons, but I mean, the thing is, it just is. Like, we don't really know. We can try to explain it. I think one of the really obvious things is that a lot of people tried to write Gospels. You even get that in Luke. You get that in John, talking at the end of John, where he says if all the stories were written down, they'd fill, all the books couldn't contain them or something. So obviously there's a lot of stories floating around. Why these 4 got were kind of held and retained, I don't really know. At different points, there were people try to harmonize them into one, like the Diatessaron is a famous example of this, which is an attempt to turn 4 into 1. But to some extent, yeah, I mean, these 4 must have come to be recognized as something like the most authentic or the most, I have to be careful here because I'm going to get the apologists saying, aha, told you. But it's not that these are perfectly historically accurate or anything, but they, in some ways, they may have risen to the top, even just as literature, even just as the, I don't know, like the cream of the crop, as it were. Now, they use each other. We know this, the synoptic gospels use each other. John, I interviewed Mark Goodacre on whether John is synoptic, and I think he convinced me, and his book convinced me, that John does know about the other three gospels and is adding to them. So I think it's not hard to understand why there could be multiple gospels, because people kept trying to improve the genre. But as to why we only have those four in our New Testament, I'm not sure. It could be a geographical thing. This has often been a way to explain it, like that there was certain preferences for gospels in different places. And as the church expanded, they just kind of shoved them together into a collection. So that's certainly a possibility that's plausible. How do we reconcile the Great Commission within the debate of canonical and non-canonical gospels? Is it possible to go back and reframe the gospels that were left out simply as the gospels of the early church movement? I'm guessing this is a question about the actual Great Commission within the debate of, I did a thing on the Great Commission arguing that the Trinity part of the Great Commission was added much, much later. I did a video on that. Is it possible to go back and reframe the gospels that were left out simply as gospels of the early church movement? Yeah, I mean, I think like I just said, there were a lot of different gospels. I've done a thing. So for example, Pete Egerton, I did a thing on that. And one of the stories from Pete Egerton is in the Gospel of John. And it looks like the Pete Egerton version is an actual earlier version of it. So there's these are, yes, it's possible to go back and reframe the gospels as gospels of the early church movement. I think they are all attempts to write biographies or to write, guidelines for Christianity. I think if you look at, this is a famous thing, maybe you know this, but earlier, like the earliest points of the Christian movement, the gospel is not a book. The gospel is the message. If you look at the Didache, for example, the gospel is a message. At some point, gospels came to refer to the book. We have Justin Martyr talking about how Christians meet and read the memoirs of the apostles, which are called gospels. So at that point, the gospel becomes a book. So this is a formal way of writing down this story and this teaching. And I think they were obviously useful for people. We have different church fathers quoting different gospels or quoting things that got left out of our gospels. So yeah, I think these were, I don't know if I'm probably not doing a great job at this question, or maybe I don't really understand how it's phrased, but yeah, they are certainly, this is certainly evidence of multiple gospels in the early church movement. I think that people used them and probably enjoyed reading them. And I think over time, these solidified into the four gospels we have. I'll leave it there for now. I don't know. You can leave more down below if I didn't do a good job answering that. Sorry. Okay, given that the Gospels offer different pictures of Jesus to suit their rhetorical goals, is there a gospel or Jesus that you find most compelling? And are there specific stories or decisions within the narrative that lead you toward feeling that way? Oh, that's a good question. I like them all. I like them all for different reasons. I love Matthew. I mean, you read the Sermon on the Mount, it's just mind-blowing. Like, it's so good. It's so incredible. So I think the rhetorical thrust of Matthew, as it were, is really powerful. I think Luke has a really beautiful picture of Jesus as sort of like a philosopher, and also very concerned with the poor. So like it's a very like ethical, it's almost like a Jesus that's like the most ethical, fitting in with like what Hellenistic people would see as like an ethical kind of holy man who upholds like Stoic ethics and that sort of thing. So I think the Jesus in Luke is really cool for that. This is like my answer is like, oh, I like them all. Mark, I love how edgy Jesus is. Like I love how unformed it feels. Like it feels like you're looking at a character who hasn't had the edges smoothed off him yet. And I really like that. He says the wrong thing, gets things wrong sometimes. I like that about Mark's Jesus. And then in John, I think, I don't know if this is an observation about the historical Jesus himself, but I still find the light and darkness, like the parallels in John, are really powerful. And some of those ideas that have such staying power in Christianity, like the word became flesh and like tabernacled or tented among us. Like these are just such powerful ideas, like taking this Greek philosophy and putting like a framework of a human being on it. And I think that's pretty incredible. So I like all of the Gospels for different reasons. I I don't know if I like the Jesus in John as much. He's kind of a little too like, I don't know, he's a little too high and mighty, a little too like, it's just like, I think you're just getting far away from a historical Jesus, if there is one in the earlier Gospels or in the other, shouldn't even say earlier Gospels, in the other Gospels. The Jesus in John is like almost a little too developed, but overall it's still it's a beautiful Gospel. Okay, I would like to see some info on dating of various biblical texts. I know they do ranges, but I see Christians trying to always make it earlier, like somehow that helps. Yeah, I mean, I'll stick with the New Testament because that's my field of expertise, as it were. But I already talked about the Gospels, so the Gospels we don't really know. Paul's letters are still thought to be pretty early, still thought to be authentic. That's still the scholarly majority position on those. So maybe late 40s, most of them written into the 50s of the Common Era, maybe a few written into the 60s. Otherwise, I'm trying to think, like a lot of stuff is probably written in the 2nd century. So Hebrews, the pastorals, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are likely in the 2nd century, which is when I did a full video on the pastorals. I'll link to it below, but, or link to it here, video on the pastorals right there. Yeah, those are probably later. Some of the Pauline, I did a thing, also interviewed a scholar on the dating of Pauline letters, and we talked about how things like Colossians probably come a little bit later. James, I don't know. I said already, James, it's tough to date James. Revelation is even tough to date, because it's, there seems to be reference to some sort of persecution. Nobody knows exactly what it is. I did a publication on Revelation once, and I talked about how it fits with like certain like ruler inscriptions that were common in Asia Minor. So that doesn't matter. But there's one really interesting theory by David Flusser, who is a professor at Hebrew. He's a Israeli professor. I forget where he taught. I think it was at Hebrew University. But he argued that Revelation was a reworking of an earlier like Zoroastrian work, which I found really interesting. And I don't know if it's got a lot of people have accepted it, but that's interesting. So Revelation, like people have argued, even like, I think, who argued this? I forget. There's also an argument that Revelation, parts of it are even like earlier, and then the Jesus stuff was added on to an older Jewish book. So, what am I doing? I'm not doing justice to this question. I don't know if any of that helps with dating biblical texts, but hopefully the one thing I hope you get as I talk about this in my very imperfect stumbling way, is that it's hard to date biblical texts sometimes, short of like clear references to either historical events or clear references to theological controversies that we kind of know when they came about. Otherwise it's hard. And manuscripts, we just don't really have early manuscripts for any biblical texts that really help with the dating very much. There's not even really like most of the earliest manuscripts are probably 3rd century. So it's really hard to get back into those earliest moments of when these are supposed to be written. So that's tough. Let's keep going. Okay, Satan. Is Satan who tempts Jesus the same concept of Satan that we have in Job, or has it shifted by the writing of that story? I already answered that. I'm sorry, I should have organized these a bit better. But yeah, this says Satan evolves and probably comes into contact with some other figures and other religions and traditions. And by the time we get First Enoch, by the time we get the Gospels, we have a Satan who is a little more of an officially like wicked being. And yeah. Next question. How has your destruction or reconstruction changed your views on some of the more disturbing depictions of God, especially in the Deuteronomistic histories? I think it's like the thing that I've landed on is that these books were written at a time that I'm glad I don't live in. Like this was a time when God was understood to be this terrible, vindictive person. God was a tribalistic God. Like these are not like the nice, friendly, divine figures that a lot of people imagine when they think of a personal God. So those are products of history, just like our own modern ideas about God are products of history and time. And the two don't usually fit together. So I don't have a lot of trouble reconciling it because I just see this as a very different, I don't read the Hebrew Bible and think like, oh, I don't know if I can, worship this God or whatever, because it's like, it's from a different time. So I've kind of made my peace with the fact that some of those stories are horrendous. Some of them are nice. There's some nice stories, and like in the Psalms and stuff, you get like some really beautiful reflections on on the worship of God. But overall, yeah, it's not pretty. Okay, we're getting into some like scholarship type questions here, less specific. Has there been anything in the last year or since you became a scholar and deconstructed that you have changed your mind on because of evidence presented to you? Oh, can I say something really quick? I've been wanting to say this for a bit because it says since I became a scholar. One of the weirdest things about getting on YouTube is hearing people call me a biblical scholar. I'm not actually like, I don't consider myself a biblical scholar. I'm still wrapping my head around this. I guess it depends on how you define the word. I'm not employed at a university and I haven't published anything in quite a while. I do have a PhD in New Testament or Christian origins. So it's been a weird process for me to start being called a biblical scholar. And somebody sent me something on Reddit the other day that was about me, and it said like, oh, scholars like CJ Cornthwaite. Like, geez, like I'm not super comfortable. Maybe it's just my own imposter syndrome, but I'm still getting used to the fact that people call me a biblical scholar. I'm not an active biblical scholar. I'm more of a YouTuber. I think Dan McClellan says this, he's more of a scholar than I am, but I think he says that what he does on YouTube is just reporting. And that's a good way to look at it for me too. Like it's more just using the skills I developed as somebody who was trained as a biblical scholar, but not currently working as a biblical scholar. So I have a little bit of imposter syndrome when people call me a biblical scholar, but nevertheless, you can decide. Okay, so sorry, coming back to the question. Has there been anything in the last year or since you became a scholar and deconstructed that you have changed your mind on because of evidence presented to me? I think I've constantly changed my mind. I think that's one of the things that I find really interesting about this work is like, I change my mind too much. Like I'll interview, somebody one week and be like, yeah, the Gospels are completely manufactured in the middle of the 2nd century. And then the next week I just interviewed James Tabor and I'll be like, oh yeah, maybe these are like written by the family of Jesus, not the Gospels, but like maybe James is written by the family of Jesus. Maybe Jude is written by the family of Jesus. So it's like, if anything, I changed my mind too much, but I think that's part of being a good scholar is like trying to get into the arguments. I just call myself a scholar again, but I do think it's part of like, for anybody who wants to evaluate these things, it's a really beautiful thing to try and get into the arguments and try to exercise them in your brain and think them through and see if you find them convincing. And one of the frustrating things about dealing with Christian apologetics, I find, is it's people who will never change their mind and have never changed their mind. Like these are people who are fundamentally uncurious about anything because they know the answers already. So it's way more interesting to me to just constantly be like, okay, like ask these questions, like ask these. I was just asking earlier in this video, I was talking about the Philippians Christ hymn. Like, is it from a mystery cult or is it actually grounded and based on like something that is Jewish and a little more like human? Like, I don't know, you could argue for both, and that's what's so fascinating. So yeah, I think I've changed my mind on a ton of things. I'm trying to think of like one huge thing in general that I've changed my mind on. I think one of the things is like I do come back sometimes to like what's called like an early high Christology, early divine Christology is kind of interesting. Like I think you do have to recognize that fairly early in the Christian movement, including in the thinking of Paul, there was something fairly high in Christology. I don't think it's because Jesus claimed to be God, despite a book that was sent to me that I find very unconvincing about it. Maybe I'll talk about that at some point. But I think it's for whatever reason, Paul is imagining this divine figure, and that works its way through. So I do think there are a lot of like interesting early moments of like divine or high Christology fairly early in the Christian movement. So that's interesting. And that's like the reason that feels a bit like changing my mind is because I think often I kind of, not always, but like there have been times when I've thought about this as being like, well, Jesus just started as this human figure like we get in the Gospels, and then slowly these stories evolved until they became more divine. But if anything, I would actually see it as the reverse now. I think it's more likely that there was some kind of early high Christology, maybe some floating sayings, like sayings, traditions about Jesus. And then the stuff about the Gospels was kind of constructed to backfill a lot of the narrative to put like more of a human figure on that early high Christology. Not to say there's not a historical Jesus there could be, but I have my doubts that the Gospels are the place to find the historical Jesus. But anyway, I think that's something I've changed my mind. Do you have a hunch about where a specific piece of scholarship may go in the future? A consensus shift in any particular area? I had Marcus Vincent on. A lot of you like Marcus Vincent. I find the work him and his team does is just so fascinating, and it hasn't yet received complete like buy-in yet. I wouldn't say it's certainly not the consensus in biblical scholarship yet, but it's putting a lot of interesting questions on the table and putting the figure of Marcion into like questions about the synoptic problem or questions about like just the development of early Christianity. So I think that's really interesting. So I think that's going to become more prominent in the future and will probably lead to more evolution of how we think about the historical Paul, or how we think about like just looking at the Pauline letters and imagining that there are different editorial glosses on them really changes how we imagine the early Christian movement or the early Christ group. So I think that's really interesting. I still find the work that I'm doing, or that I did do on associations with when I was doing my PhD, and I worked with John Kloppenborg, who's published a book on this. I've had him on the channel too, and we've talked about it. I find that work really interesting too, and it has a lot of potential for opening up new avenues in the study of early Christianity, and I think not enough people have paid attention to it yet, but hopefully people do. Not just because I was a part of it, but because when you're doing this comparative work, looking at different social formations that are similar to early Christ groups, it's amazing what you see when you start to do that work, and it starts to situate, or it does a better job of situating early Christ groups in their kind of social, or in their social environment. So that's definitely something that's really exciting to watch. What attested document do you think would cause the biggest stir in biblical studies? Which document would you personally think would be the most interesting to find? That's a good question. What attested document would cause the biggest stir in biblical studies? Well, I've been talking about Marcion. Marcion's gospel would be huge. There is one candidate, actually. I should do a video on this sometimes, but there's one manuscript that some have argued is Marcionite. Q is the famous one, the hypothetical source text, but I'm still pretty convinced that there was some form of a sayings gospel. So any other like new manuscripts like that would be really cool. Those are big ones. I find I've done things on fragments of other early gospels, but it's just like nobody really pays attention. Like we literally have fragments of other gospels. I've done a few videos on them. And most people just want to hear about, not most, I'm not saying if you're watching this, you're probably a nerd like me, but a lot of the videos that I've done on those don't really get much traction. Maybe I need to just try again, and maybe it's my fault for not presenting it well or something. But it's mind-blowing to me that we have other gospels. Like we have fragments of other gospels that are not Gnostic, they're not late, they're like as early as our canonical gospels, maybe even earlier. We have these fragments, and it's just like not enough people know that. So that like finding more of those, or bigger versions of those, or just paying more attention to those, I think would be a lot of fun too, and have some very interesting potential. I think that's it for documents. I mean, any document I could find, I would love. Okay, Sepphoris. We're talking about doing back to some, I think, archaeological questions now. Sepphoris. Jesus grew up a few miles down the road from a thriving Hellenistic Roman city. What is the scholarly consensus about this? Well, yeah, exactly that. I think that it's a thriving Hellenistic Roman city. I just interviewed James Tabor again. This is my most recent interview, so it's fresh in my mind, but he talked about Sepphoris. And I didn't realize that he said that it wasn't really commonly acknowledged when he was in grad school that Sepphoris was there. I was on a dig once in the Galilee in Tiberias, an archaeological dig, and I didn't go to the week after I left, they were doing like a field trip to Sepphoris. So annoyingly, I actually didn't get to go to Sepphoris, and I would have enjoyed it. Maybe I'll ask James Tabor if I can come visit him next time he's there. But so Sepphoris was a town during the time of Jesus, was kind of the regional hub of culture, all that sort of thing. We can imagine that maybe if Jesus and his family were work people, they may have worked there doing different types of day labor or specialized construction or something. That's kind of as much as I know about Sepphoris. Okay, next question. The flight to Pella. I want to know what scholars think about the Jerusalem Jesus movement at and after 70 CE. How might it have devastated the historical documents and memory of Jesus? I think, there's a story about the earliest Christians fleeing away to Pella when the Romans attacked. And then the connection in the Gospels is that when I guess like Luke says, like, flee to the mountains when you see the armies encamped around Jerusalem, that like that's what this is a reference to. So there is this story about this like thriving Christian community. It's fairly commonly accepted by scholars, I think, that the fall of Jerusalem and the Roman attack was probably in some way responsible for spreading the Christian movement, because it did force, whether they went to Pella or not, like it did force people out, and people were taken back to Rome, and like all like different movements of people. So that's pretty well established. I think we just don't know all that much about the Jerusalem Jesus movement, though, because it's so far, like it came so much later. Again, like James Tabor will try to put a lot of flesh on it and try to put some of these pictures together, and his work's really fascinating. It's definitely worth a look. But there's just only so much we know, and we just get these fragmentary pictures of like the Ebionites, for example, which is Ebionim just means poor in Aramaic, Hebrew Aramaic. Yeah, these are apparently like early Christians in that region who still followed the Jewish law, maybe thought Paul was a heretic. So there were different movements, like we just don't know that much about them. Our knowledge of them is very, very fragmentary, but super interesting. Do you think there's a big difference between the concept of the personhood of God that early Jewish people had and the concepts that modern day Christians have? Plus, do you think there are any concepts about God that Christians get wrong that other religions might have a better understanding of? Oh, this is like a theological question. I think the idea, personhood of God, like I think what we see at the time of early Christianity, somebody mentioned Philo earlier. So like coming to somebody like Philo, you have a mixing, like a diasporic mixing of Jewish concepts of God, if I could call them that, and Greek concepts of God, if I could call them that. It's not a perfect division, but a lot of that kind of melting pot of diaspora in the ancient Mediterranean gave us a lot of the things we think about God today. So for example, this could be like the idea of the Logos is the famous one. This is a famous like Greek philosophical category. The Logos is how an unmoved mover, like how the God who can't move does things, because of this Logos, which Christians come to associate with Jesus. So I think that like that intersection, there's no intersection of cultures that ever leaves people unchanged. Like when two cultures intersect, whether it's in a diaspora, whether it's Babylonian captivity, whether it's Jews like being attacked by the Romans and occupied by the Romans, like these change people. These are the movements that change people, and the intersection of the ideas from all of those moments changed all of the movements to follow. In the same way, for example, like Judaism today is not Judaism in the first century either. Like both what we now see as Judaism and what we now see as Christianity were two like streams that came out of the first century and sort of defined each other throughout history. So I do think that there is probably a difference in the concept of the personhood of God in antiquity. I think some of them are pretty consistent, but I think my experience with modern Christianity is much more of a personal God. It's much more of a, I think there's a lot more even, I'm trying to think of like how to do this justice, but like in evangelical churches, for example, it was like, well, anthropologists have argued that this is probably like very influenced by the hippie movement, where God becomes about like a feeling and very personal and very like touchy-feely. I feel God, I sense God, that kind of thing. So I think there's a constant evolution with how people interact with the idea of God and how God is viewed. So I don't know if I did a good job of that. I'm going to move on, but yeah, I mean, I think that the ideas of God are always evolving. Oh, this is an interesting question though. Do you think there are any concepts about God that Christians get wrong that other religions might have a better understanding of? It's not that Christians get wrong, but I think it's just worth paying attention to how other religions see God. But this is like a practice thing, not necessarily anything to do with history. But for practice, it can be worth like paying attention to how other religions understand their God, and sometimes also realizing how much similarity there was. I remember one time maybe we're still friends, but I haven't talked to her in a long time. But I had a Muslim friend who would talk about like prayer, and I remember one day just being like, "Well, that sounds a lot like when I pray," you know. So sometimes we see that we don't have as much difference between us as we imagine. Okay. I would love to hear your thoughts on universalism, especially if you think it was likely to have been potentially proposed in any form by any biblical authors. I think the one thing I have said in a couple recent videos is I think that we don't give enough credit to the fact that there are universalism is it's a modern theological word. So like, that's not quite the right word, but there are tendencies in early Christian literature that look a little bit like universalism. So like the idea that just as an Adam, what's the line? Like in Paul, he says in Romans, like, as in Adam all died, so like through Christ all might be made alive. I think I'm getting it mixed up with Handel's Messiah too. But you do have these like universalistic tendencies. I did a Christmas reflection and I was talking about how it's like good news to all people, like to all the ethne, all the nations, all the Gentiles. Like, so there are themes of universalism throughout the Christian scriptures. And I think what happens is a lot of modern readers tend to ignore those and focus a lot more on what fits their own personal reading style, which for most Protestants or Catholics or whatever tends to be about exclusionary belief, like God came for us basically, and like we are the ones who are the ones following God. Okay. What actual evidence is there that the Gospels and Paul were influenced by the Stoics? I think it's important to understand that like it's not as simple as like Paul studied under a Stoic or something like that. Like what you need to look at is during this time period when the Gospels and Paul were writing, during this time period, we often call it, you could call it like Middle Platonism, Middle Stoicism. Like these are two different but similar things, because what was actually happening is there was a lot of this kind of the evolution of Greek philosophy was happening, and Stoicism was like, I've done a lot of work in my own like academic life on Philo of Alexandria and the impact of like Platonism and Stoicism on his thought. So it's not so much that like Paul was a Stoic, it's that there are ideas in the air that seem to work their way into the Gospels or into the letters of Paul that do come from Stoicism. Now, that being said, I don't actually think Paul has that much of it. In the authentic letters of Paul, I don't think there's that much. I'm trying to think about what's there. Like where you do get really Stoic language is in the later books that we consider forgeries. So in the pastorals, in 1st and 2nd Peter, like you start to get really Stoic language about like language like virtues, and it becomes Christian virtue becomes like in some ways like denying yourself. Like there's a lot of like right living kind of denying the passions is a little too on the nose, but there's a lot of Stoic virtues like eusebia, piety, like these virtues end up working their way into early Christian literature. So that's what you kind of look at, is not so much like Paul borrowed from Stoicism, because Stoicism isn't just one thing, but there are themes and things in the air in antiquity around the time when Paul was writing, or around the time when the Gospels were written, around the time when these later letters were being written in Paul's name or in Peter's name. And these worked their way into this literature because they were just ideas of the time, especially when you're writing religious literature about exceptional people doing exceptional things. This tends to kind of work its way in. Okay. Getting on to the end here. Okay. What Bible translation is best? Good question. I like the NRSV. I know a lot of people like the NRSV. In terms of like just reading, if you just want to read the Bible just to kind of get a sense of what's there and enjoy it, and like, I don't think it matters that much. Like, I don't actually think you need to have the most accurate translation to read. The problem comes in when people want to build theology around the Bible, because in that case, you get stuff that like the NIV is actually, in some cases, it actually doesn't translate what's in the Greek, and it translates it based on ideology. I was just doing, because it's Christmas, I was looking at the famous thing in Isaiah where it talks about like a virgin conceiving, and this is pretty common knowledge, but in Hebrew, it actually just says a young woman is pregnant and will give birth. And this is what the NRSV says. If you read the NRSV, it says a young woman is pregnant, will give birth. In the NIV, it still says a virgin will conceive and bear a son. Now, the translators of the NIV knew that that's not what it says in the Hebrew, but they made a decision to translate that based on a theological conviction that this is the way it's supposed to be read. So that's where it matters. It starts to matter when you have a Bible translation and you're trying to build doctrine. If you're in a church, you're trying to figure out, I don't know, some people, I don't do this anymore, but some people are like, what's biblical about, what does the Bible say about this thing? Like, that's where it actually kind of does matter. And if you're trying to make some of those decisions, I would say my first thought is don't. But anyway, if you're trying to make like doctrinal decisions or something, I guess the NRSV would probably be a little better. But even so, I mean, yeah, if you're just reading, you're just trying to get a sense of what's there, read what you enjoy, read the message if you want. I don't care. Like if it helps you kind of understand the biblical text and get what's there. Okay, this person asks, what is your favorite story from the Bible? Oh my gosh. That's a tough question. My favorite story. When I was a youth pastor, I used to love, kind of weird looking back on this, but I used to love the story, telling the story of like Jael. I always loved with a tent peg through the head. Elijah and the fire from heaven was a favorite story from the Hebrew Bible. New Testament. What's my favorite story? I already said this. I already said the Beatitudes and stuff, but that's not really a story. What's my favorite story? One that comes to mind is the woman caught in adultery in John. I know it's not authentic to the Gospel of John, but maybe it's a testimony to its staying power. But the story of the woman caught in adultery and Jesus is going sin no more. I mean, that's a beautiful story. And I think there's a reason why it made it into the Gospel of John and stayed there. It's a pretty fantastic story. So maybe that's one of my favorites. Okay. Final question. Did you listen to any podcasts before you started your channel? Which did you like most? I love History Valley is still one of my favorites. I was on there a couple weeks ago. I love listening to Bible scholars on there. I love Myth Vision. I listened to Deconstruction Zone. What else? Like before, I didn't spend too much time before. What else was there? I'm not even sure. Those are like the main ones in biblical studies. And then I used to listen to like Sam Harris and stuff like that. So I mean, I listen to a lot of different things. I still love listening to anything by Christopher Hitchens. And then there's a lot of like, often when I get into listening to somebody, I'm not so much looking for a specific podcast. I just want to hear that person talking. So if there's a certain academic, I love their ideas, I'll go listen to them on 10 different podcasts wherever I can find them. So that's kind of the way I approach podcasts sometimes, which is maybe not the best way to do it, but yeah, hope that's interesting. So how long did this take? An hour. We're just at an hour. So that's not too bad. Yeah, I hope this was interesting. This was like rapid fire. I'm going to do the deconstruction one soon, but I hope this one wasn't too technical, but there was a lot of technical questions here. I hope I did justice to all of them. Definitely not a perfect science, but I had fun kind of thinking these through and trying to do some rapid fire answers. If you have more questions, if you disagree with my answers, if you want to correct my answers, I probably made a mistake or two as I did this, leave it down below. Love to know what you think. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Happy New Year. We are rocking on to 2026, which is wild. So yeah, I'm excited for 2026. Lots more interviews with biblical scholars, lots more stuff to learn. So yeah, thanks. I'll see you next time.